So we're going to talk about redistricting, which particularly for Iowans is something we don't actually get to talk about that much because our redistricting system is so unusual relative to what we're going to hear about today. Of course, our redistricting system is done without partisan data. So they draw lines according to classic principles of counties and communities of interest and things like that. And that makes it a really unusual system relative to the rest of the U.S. And so our speakers are going to be talking about lots of variety in redistricting today. But as we get started, I will introduce each of them. I want to remind you just one last time that there are cards there if you have questions that you think of as they're chatting. We'll come and collect them before the Q&A starts. Finally, I was told to say this, stage whisper, we're not supposed to have drinks in here since I'm violating my own rule. Just don't spill them. Okay. All right, so the first person we're going to welcome is Mike Crespin. Mike is the Associate Director of the Carl Albert Congressional Research and Studies Center at the University of Oklahoma and an Associate Professor of Political Science. A great deal of his work shows how changes in district boundaries influence the behavior of individuals and elected officials. Mike?
So, first I want to start off by saying thank you Tracy and to Pete and to Leslie for having me out here. It's been a great visit so far. I'll have to say I've been in Iowa for 24 hours. I haven't met a single presidential candidate. Clearly disappointed in this visit. Before we get going too, we talked a little bit at lunch how they rate some of these events that go on fairness. And this panel was rated as fair, and I think it's because I did my graduate work at Michigan State. Yeah, I'm laying it down now. But this is very fair, so you let a Spartan come, right? And so this is a very great, nice thing to do. So please don't hold that against me and ask me very difficult questions. As a Spartan, I can't answer them. So I was asked today to sort of give a little bit of an overview of redistricting and perhaps touch on a little bit about what some of my esteemed colleagues are going to talk about in their talks. Here's my clicker. And so first just talk a little bit about redistricting, the process, some constraints, and why it matters. So redistricting is supposed to happen in a 10-year cycle. So every 10 years, we have a census. We count up the entire population. In this process, we actually have to count individual noses. So we go around. It'd actually be more accurate if we estimated how many people there were. But according to the Constitution, we have to actually go around and count. It's my opinion, the census is actually like a very inaccurate measure, right? So it takes place over the course of a year. So during that time, people die. People are born. Lots of people are counted multiple times. I think about college students, right? So if you're a college student in the dorm in an apartment, you're going to get the form. It's going to come to you, or the worker's going to come and say how many people live here, and they're going to count you up. A different worker is going to go to your parents' house, and they're going to say how many people live here. And their parents are going to say, well, I'm paying for that kid, in college. There's one down in the basement. There's another. And so some people are counted multiple times. Other people are missed, right? So you might have homeless are missed. You might have people who don't want the government to count them for whatever reason are missed. Other groups of people that are missed are people who are overseas. And this actually it turns out to be important. A lot of people in the state of Utah go on missions for multiple years, and they're not counted. Utah missed out on a representative. They were to get the next person if all the people overseas doing mission were counted. So in some ways, it's a very flawed process, but it's the one that we use. So we have our census. We count up everyone in the country as best as possible. And then we divide up the districts amongst the states. For many states, they remain the same. They get the same number of seats from year to year. Some pick up. My colleague from California knows California frequently gains seats. I have another colleague from Texas. Texas is usually the winner in this process, I think. They're getting a lot of seats. I'm originally from New York. We've been slowly over the years losing seats. Seats have been moving south, and they've been moving west. In some ways, this affects our political process. So we have more people living in states that tend to be more conservative. Now, some of those states, maybe a state like North Carolina, a lot of people from New York moved. North Carolina's kind of in the middle sometimes. Sometimes it's red, but it's also gone blue now and again. So the way people move around the country and the way seats are divided up can influence our outcomes at the end. So how does this process work? Most redistricting is done by legislatures. So the general process is move forward as some sort of bill where plans are introduced, there's debate, there might be some revisions, it has to pass both chambers, and that some states it has to go to the governor, some states it does not. Some states, when you have unified control, so a state like Oklahoma, where the Republicans control the House, the Senate, and the governor's office, you're going to have a plan that's going to be very good for the Republicans, right? They're a bit of a Republican gerrymander. In the few states that are controlled by all Democrats, you're going to get a Democratic gerrymander. I lived in Georgia for a while, and the Democrats hung on and hung on and hung on, and they really gerrymandered that state in favor of the Democrats. Now the Republicans then take control eventually of the House, of the Senate, the governorship, and they gerrymander it back the other way in favor of the Republicans. So this gerrymandering is not, a Republican thing or a Democratic thing. It's a partisan thing. In some instances, the state has divided government. So perhaps the Democrats control the legislature, and you have a Republican governor, or the two chambers are split. And you usually get what we call an incumbent protection plan, where they just decide to return everyone to office, right? Sort of that's the plan that can work. When I lived in New York, there was a very long standing between the state House and state Senate, where the state House would draw their districts and it would be Democratic, and the state Senate would draw their districts and it would be Republican. So the state Senate in New York was Republican for a long time, until actually you got a couple people that sort of caucused with the other party. There's actually a great controversy where they did not know who controlled the Senate. There's a couple people who decided to caucus with the Republican Party, probably giving them control, but two of those people were under indictment. Now maybe four of them. If you follow New York politics, most everyone's under indictment at one time or another. But anyway, so sometimes it's a little unclear what's going to happen. So that's I'd say the standard way is the legislature does it, and you either end up with an incumbent protection plan or you end up with a partisan gerrymander. Another outcome another way you can do this is through commissions. You guys are probably more familiar with the Iowa Commission than I am. Iowa Commission is generally what we call an advisory commission. So they come up with the plan, and it does have to be approved by the legislature. There's other states like California, which I'll only touch on briefly, because my colleagues could talk about that they have a more independent process. Arizona also has a fairly independent redistricting commission. There's some commissions that are very partisan, where they'll pick members from the Democratic Party, members from the Republican Party, and they'll try to draw districts. New Jersey has a partisan side with Democrats and Republicans, and then they have to pick a tiebreaker. For a number of years, it was a political scientist. Larry Bartels was the tiebreaker from Princeton for a number of years. I don't know who was the tiebreaker the last time around. Rosenthal has been the tiebreaker as well. So political scientists can matter sometimes. And sometimes the plans get thrown into the courts, and many cases end up getting thrown. Plans end up getting thrown into the courts for violating some sort of rule or another. I've done some research on this, looking at courts and commissions and legislatures, and looking at who draws the plan and the outcomes, and looking over a long time frame. When you take the process outside the legislature, the outcomes tend to be more competitive. Now, they're not extremely competitive. I don't think it's a panacea. But if you want to increase competition, I would say you want to take the process out of the legislature. It doesn't happen all the time. Commissions overall in 2012, the elections weren't any more competitive than legislative drawn districts. Some years they are, some years they're not. Some states they are, some states they're not. But over sort of long history, these methods give us a little bit more competition. So in redistricting, we're operating under some constraints. The first constraint is equal population. So within a state, the populations of the congressional districts have to be as equal as you can make them. So if there's a plan and someone wants to sue and say that plan is not fair, the first thing you're probably going to look at is, are the populations different? And if they are, you probably have a decent shot at a case. I think there's a case in Arizona where there's a balance between sort of racial redistricting and the Voting Rights Act and equal population. And so the case is being brought on the populations are different. So states or districts have to be contiguous. So you can't have part of a district over here and part of a district over here. They have to be connected in one way or another. Now that connection can be in interstates, right? As long as there's a physical connection. My favorite district was actually, it was in California. I have favorite districts. And the story goes, it was only connected during low tide. And I don't know like if they sued or what happened with that, but I thought it was a pretty interesting case. Every once in a while, they'll draw these districts and they'll forget a town, right? So there's actually these legal definitions that they'll list like the streets and the counties and what belongs in what. It's not the drawing of the map. You have to have like sort of this legal definition. Every once in a while, they'll forget a city or a town and we'll just have to revise the law and say, yes, it needs to go there. So that's the other like real constraint. I guess the third is the Voting Rights Act. And one of my colleagues is going to talk a little bit more about the Voting Rights Act and the Shelby case. But sort of in a simplistic way, you're not allowed to draw districts that make it too difficult for minority voters to elect someone of their choice. And that's a very simplistic way of looking at that. But that's another constraint that a lot of states are under. There's been this recent case, the Shelby case, it pulls that back a little bit. I'll leave it at that. Some people have sort of a wish list, like how could we make redistricting better, or what could we do to improve it? One is, could we have more competitive districts? And the answer is maybe yes in some places. So the standard line you're going to get from political scientists is redistricting isn't the problem, it's really where everybody lives. So Democrats tend to cluster in cities, and Republicans tend to live everywhere else. So it's fairly easy to draw kind of normal looking districts with lots of Democrats in some districts, and they're sort of out of the cities, and then districts filled with Republicans who are filling the rest of the places. So that's sort of something people want. It's to be a little harder to get than you want. You can't just say like, well, can't you just draw these competitive districts? It's not that simple. What else do people want? No funny shapes. People seem to look at funny shaped districts and think like, well, that's a bad thing. I don't know if that's necessarily good or bad, but people want normal looking districts. That's easy in some places. I think it's easier in Iowa, right? You have nice square counties, so you can draw these nice square-ish looking districts. I live in Oklahoma. I'll show you some maps. We're not quite as square. We have some rivers that change things. And then other people, and I think this is important, want to keep cities and towns intact, right? So you don't want to draw a line through the middle of a city, especially a smaller city, and half the people are in one district and half are in another. I taught previously at the University of Texas at Dallas, and they actually split the campus. So the freshman dorm was in, it was in Pete Sessions' district, and the rest of the campus was in Johnson's district. So it was great. I can invite 2 members of Congress to like campus, and I had a reason for them to be there, but it makes it a little confusing for voters sometimes. So just real quick, this is the plans that some different states use, and I already talked about this. So California, Arizona, Washington, and Idaho use a fairly independent redistricting commission method. I'd say it's important, very important in a state like California because there's lots of districts. An independent commission in Idaho, especially at the congressional level, is not that important, right? I mean, you're going to change that line just a little bit, year to year. Also probably important in a state like Arizona. You can see the normal method, all these states, is with the legislature, and then we have different kinds of commissions. And so I'm just going to jump through that. I was asked too to talk a little bit about how is this redistricting going to influence the upcoming election. So I'm going to do that by looking at maps from Oklahoma from 1950. I'm not one for normally listening to directions, so I work at the Carl Albert Center, amongst other things, is an archive. So I did a little search for redistricting, and I found these maps from the 1950 plan. And so we like to think of like, oh, redistricting, it's this new thing, it's making politics really terrible, but it's not. Redistricting is something that's gone on the entire history of our country. right? So the gerrymander comes from a Massachusetts state legislative race, from over 200 years ago. And there's been gerrymandering and redistricting over this long time period. So first, just here's the original plan. This is House Bill 78 from Oklahoma, where they just have the districts and the population. And so that's the original plan that's introduced. Very quickly, I guess this is up here, someone offers an amendment. So I'm not going to go through all the lines, but they say, let's just change the lines a little bit, right? And so they didn't like the original plan. Let's offer an amendment. So even in the 50s, there was fights over how we're going to draw the lines. How does the process actually work? So in the 50s, you took your map, you took your pen, and you would draw the districts. Now today, people like to say, oh, look, we have GIS. It makes it so easy to do gerrymandering. You can gerrymander just as easily in the 1950s with a red pen, right? In any state, there's a handful of people who know every single neighborhood, right? They know every single county. They know how they vote. They don't even need to look at any data, right? They can come up with a plan that's going to be advantageous to them, right? They can do it just as easily with a marker as they can do with a sophisticated GIS program. And maybe it's a little easier with the GIS programs, but you can get any outcome that you want without this sort of sophisticated algorithm. So the Democrats had their own plan here. I assume the Republicans had an option that they wanted to come up with. One thing I want to point out is prior to 1964, we had some cases, the Westbury v. Sanders case, the Baker v. Carr case. Districts did not have to be equal in population. And so this map points out these vast disparities in the sizes of the district. So District 2 here, this includes Tulsa, is up here, has 487,000 people in it. Right? So that's a fair amount of people. District 6, which is out in the panhandle of Oklahoma, nobody lives there. It's fairly large geographically and only has 222,000 people. Right? So like we think of like one person, one vote is fundamental to American democracy. It wasn't until 1964 that sort of became part of what we do. And so this is a good example. If you look at maps of Georgia, you're going to find similar things. Any state that has cities and then a rural population, it tends to have rural districts with fewer voters, urban districts with more voters. So I'll just jump through the rest of the maps here. What do we care about 2016? I would say advantage Republicans. And so the main reason the Republicans are advantaged is they drew the districts in 2012. So in 2008, 2010, the Republicans put a lot of time, effort, money into winning state legislatures and into winning governor's offices, right? And so they did this so they knew they would control redistricting for the 2012 election. They got to draw the lines. They draw districts that were advantageous to them. And we're going to see this reverberate throughout all the elections. It's going to make it harder for the Democrats to take control of the House, right? If I had to place a bet who's going to control the House in 2016 or after the 2016 election, it's going to be the Republicans. It's going to be really hard for the Democrats to take back because they didn't control the lines. So they drew 40% of the seats in 2010. The Democrats only drew 10%, and the remaining 50% sort of a mixed between divided courts and commissions. If we look at sort of an early guess at who's going to win these seats, 170 seats are safe for Democrats, 209 seats are safe for Republicans. You only need 218 to control the House. Right, so the Republicans are basically starting off with 209 in the pocket and just need to win 9 more. So I think there's a pretty good chance that they're going to be able to do that. So is redistricting a problem? In some ways, yes. Right. So there's an argument that too many representatives are safe. Representative Loebsack made this argument at the beginning. He asked us, hey, if you think I'm wrong, please send me the information. There's actually a lot of political science literature that says, redistricting isn't really the root cause of polarization. Professor Brunell has written a book that says having safe representatives in some ways is good, right? If you're a constituent of that district, it's great, right? Especially if you voted for that person, right? You have a representative that represents you really well in the Congress. And so, if redistricting was a problem, if people were really upset with the Congress, we'd see incumbents losing left and right, but we don't. Right? They're getting reelected at pretty high rates. So generally the argument is, look, redistricting is bad in all the other districts. In my district, it's doing the right thing. So in some ways, this can be good for representation if lots of people have a person that's representing their views. We're just upset at all the other members of Congress. Questions of, can we make races more competitive and less gerrymandered? California has tried a system that does this with an independent commission. California, some other states, they've changed the state constitutions. I'm sorry, I might be wrong about California, but some states have changed the state constitutions that say, look, one of the things you have to try to do in drawing districts is try to make them competitive. So you can impose additional constraints to change the districting process. So California has tried this, and I think Dr. Brunell is also going to talk about some other avenues for reform. So I'm going to leave it at that, let my colleagues talk about some more specific cases as well, and we'll move on.
Okay, the first speaker we're going to welcome, who's rummaging in his book bag, so I'm going to talk really slow, is Eric McGhee. Eric is a research fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California, which I have to try really hard not to mix up with the Iowa Public Policy Institute. Where do I work? Public Policy Center, where he focuses on elections, legislative behavior, political reform, and public opinion. His research on elections and electoral reform has appeared in numerous academic journals, and his work has been profiled on National Public Radio and the Washington Post, the New York Times, and The Economist. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to repeat the thanks to everybody who's hung around for this panel. The redistricting community, even among the population of politics geeks, is sort of notoriously insular, and we only get usually that moment in the sun once every 10 years, and otherwise we're sort of back under our rock, maybe studying other things. So it's nice to get a moment in the sun in between those periodic moments of fame and fortune. So I want to talk today about California's experience with redistricting, which, as was just mentioned, is it's a new thing in California, and it's unusual nationally. It's not something that has been adopted in a lot of other states yet. So California in 2001 had a redistricting that was what you would call an incumbent protection gerrymander. It was designed, especially the congressional plan, was designed to protect incumbents on both sides. And that produced a modest amount of decline in the state assembly and state senate races, and a significant decline in House races. And there was also, I think, key to the politics that emerged from this was a really limited effort in this plan to try to boost minority representation. In California, minority representation, as you can imagine, it's a very large, very diverse state. That's a big deal. It's an important issue. And I think the outcome of that, not only reducing competition, but also failing to try and make efforts to improve minority representation, it really split the traditional coalitions that had existed around reform. There had been multiple efforts throughout the 1980s in particular in California to try and pass some kind of independent redistricting commission. These efforts were almost always launched by Republicans, and then they immediately got tainted with a partisan lens, right? So what was different this time around is suddenly a lot of activists in minority communities were like, hey, we don't really like these districts either. And they were kind of provisionally on the same side as the Democrats, but as soon as they saw a good opportunity to jump ship, they really did so, and that helped build a new coalition around reform. So there was actually one additional attempt to pass an independent commission. Arnold Schwarzenegger tried to get something through. It ended up getting that same sort of partisan taint to it. And, but then there was a follow-on effort which actually passed in 2008 and established this very different system. So the old system was the very traditional system. You had the legislature draw the lines. They drew their own districts, plus what we call the Board of Equalization, which is a 4-member body that deals with tax matters, and nobody has any idea who they are or what they do. And then the congressional districts, and there's quite a number of them in California. This system, as is typical of legislatively drawn districts, has basically zero transparency. If you've ever looked at a redistricting bill that comes out of a legislature, it is essentially a list of census blocks. And they don't tell you why they chose those census blocks for this. I mean, so it would be District 1, census block, census block, census block, right? District 2, blah, blah, blah. And they don't tell you why they put one set of blocks in one district versus another. They make no attempt to justify it. There were a few hearings, but not many. Most of the decisions that were made about drawing the districts were made behind closed doors, so it was not a terribly transparent process. The new system, what is called the Citizens Redistricting Commission, was a commission of citizens, so people applied to be on this commission. This is different than Iowa's system. Iowa also has a commission system, as was mentioned, but Iowa's system is there's sort of an analyst's office for the legislature, and every 10 years they become the redistricting people as well. And then, of course, the legislature has to approve it. This is a system where the people who ended up serving came from the general population, maybe a select subset of that population, but nonetheless from the general population. They were chosen by the state auditor's office, which is itself an independent agency. And they were chosen by a very complex set of procedures that was designed to ensure their independence from the political establishment to the extent that it was possible to do it. So you couldn't give more than a certain amount of money to any single candidate. You couldn't be a staffer for a legislator or a member of Congress. You couldn't be a member of Congress or a legislator yourself, obviously. You couldn't have served in office for the last I think it was 10 years, and you had to agree not to serve in office for the next 10 years after you were done. A lot of rules like that. There were detailed instructions about the goals. So Mike mentioned a lot of the potential goals that you can have in redistricting, compactness and not splitting cities and counties. These kinds of things were explicitly laid out in the law and ranked according to their priorities. So you had to satisfy some first and then others second, and if there was a conflict, you had to resolve the conflict toward the top of the list. And finally, it was a highly transparent system in the sense that they had all of their meetings online. They were actually streamed online. All of their decisions had to be made in public, and they had to justify, and actually to me this is, as I'll mention in a second, this is an important point, they had to justify all of their decisions after they made them. They had to come up with a document that justified them. So what are the arguments for doing it this way? Well, one is just more sensible districts because you've got compactness, more representative, whatever. More competitiveness. This was an argument that was often made. Higher turnout. People said, oh, it's going to boost turnout in California because people will have all these competitive races. You'd get more moderate representation. This is actually oh my gosh, this isn't going. I'm screwed that up. I am so sorry. I'm just talking and I have a slide. It's like, oh, this California. So I actually have slides that I forgot that this isn't connected. Anyway, got a new Citizens Redistricting Commission. Okay, so we moderate representation. So that the idea that voters would cross party lines to support moderate candidates, and so they'd win more often. That was actually probably the most significant argument for the commission. And then ending the conflict of interest, where legislators drew their own lines. Okay, I got to remember to hit both. So what I'm going to do is just kind of go through the evidence that we have so far for how all that stuff turned out. And I'm going to go kind of in the order of the things that were listed in the law that the commission was supposed to respect. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about competitiveness, which was actually not one of the criteria that they were supposed to consider. So did it have more minority representation? They were required to respond to the needs of the Voting Rights Act very explicitly. The answer is yes, especially Latino representation went up quite a bit. I'm showing sort of, there was a 2001 plan, that's the old one. 2011 draft plan, they came out with a draft in June of 2011, and then they changed it and produced a different plan in August of 2011. And the fact that there was change between the draft and the final indicates that this isn't just about changes in the population of the state. They actually were explicitly drawing lines to produce certain outcomes. And actually produced the very first Asian majority district in California's history. Did it split fewer cities and counties? A little bit. And I think this gets at the idea that even though people tend to focus on the shape of districts, that's actually not necessarily the perfect way to identify a gerrymander. To me, a gerrymander is any district plan that elevates one goal above all others, one or two goals, say. That's not necessarily going to, even if you have a broad diversity of goals, you may end up with some funny shaped districts. And they're going to split cities and counties because people don't live in perfectly shaped boxes and circles, right? So they actually didn't do that much of a better job, but a little bit better. Did it improve the compactness of the districts? Yes. And you know, in a proportional sense, quite significantly. This is just one measure that you can use for compactness. But nonetheless, it didn't produce, again, perfectly compact districts, just better ones than had existed before. And then another thing they were supposed to pay attention to was nesting, which is where you put two assembly districts perfectly within a larger Senate district, because there's 40 Senate seats and 80 assembly seats. And they did a better job there as well, though again, their draft plan did almost a perfect job, and then people were like, what happened to the Latino representation? So then they abandoned it a little bit for the final. Now, did it create more competitive seats? Again, this is not one of the things that they were supposed to do, but the answer is yes, it did a little bit. This is just by party registration. Made a big difference for the House, because again, the House seats were quite obviously an incumbent gerrymander. I'm going to skip over these curves here. Did it produce more open seats? Yes. A bunch of incumbents actually retired, but again, like it did for the House and the Assembly, not really for the Senate, and then it all kind of dropped off. Again, the Senate is sort of the weird outlier. So you saw a disruption when the districts were first used, and then in 2014 things returned a little bit more to normal. And then incumbents tended to run, and one of the radical changes here was that the districts lines were very different. And so incumbents had to move all around. There was a real reshuffling in the political class, and so a lot of incumbents were running in districts that were very different from the ones they had traditionally represented. Races have also been closer, so not just the party registration of the districts, but actual outcomes have been a little closer. Turnout has been a disappointment, right? Because turnout in California is down, not really for presidential races, but in 2014, you can see at the very end here for midterms, we had a really abysmal turnout, but so did a lot of other people. But relative turnout also, if you compare California to other states, we're on sort of a downward path. So we didn't do well in that regard. Now, returning back to these arguments for the commission, I think I should mention that you know, I think probably up to this point I've sounded like something of a booster of this system, and I think I kind of am in the sense that I got convinced. I was quite a skeptic when they were considering this idea, and I was pretty convinced that the outcome was a good one, and it's definitely something worth trying, keep continuing with in California, and then trying in other states in the future. Were the districts more sensible? Yeah, actually they kind of were, like on multiple dimensions. Were the outcomes more competitive? Yeah, they were more competitive. Was turnout higher? No, but I think that was overselling the reform anyway. And I think the one point of caution is that the changes that you're seeing here are relative to the old plan, and that old plan was fairly extreme. You can't imagine that this kind of change is going to emerge in every state that adopts a system like this. But nonetheless, it did produce some positive outcomes. Now, moderate representation, I think, is still sort of an open question. I have a paper I'm working on with Boris Shore at Georgetown, and we've been looking at this with his data, and I've actually found that the answer there is kind of yes. So in contrast to much of political science research, there is some evidence that the redistricting specifically, as opposed to, we also passed a new primary system, the top 2 primary, and that doesn't seem to have had much effect. But the redistricting, yeah, maybe on the border. Did it end a conflict of interest? I think sort of by definition, because legislators were no longer drawing their own districts, so to the extent that that's important, it's something to keep in mind. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. Our next speaker is Thomas Brunell. He's a professor of political science at the University of Texas at Dallas. He has published dozens of articles and book chapters, dozens, ooh, yeah, on elections, redistricting, political parties, and the Voting Rights Act. He has served as an expert witness for redistricting-related litigation and has testified in federal and state courts around the country. Welcome, Thomas.
All right, thank you, Tracy, for inviting me, and Leslie for organizing everything. It's great to be here in Iowa. I'm also going to talk about redistricting, and I'm going to talk a little bit about partisan gerrymandering. That was kind of what I was tasked with doing. But rather than trying to convince you of different ways to measure it, which is what we're really interested in political science, I'd like to really talk about reforms. I think that's kind of much more interesting from a public policy perspective. And I think there's some very good methods of reforms, and this kind of follows up nicely with what Eric talked about, although I'm not a fan of commissions, so I'll give you a little bit of a different view, I suppose. Okay, so every 10 years, like Mike said, we redraw the electoral boundaries for all congressional seats, but also all state legislative seats as well. So this is really a massive undertaking. So it affects both legislative representation and also congressional representation. And the reason that, well, I'll get to that in a second. So in most states, as Mike pointed out, though not in Iowa, passing a new map is done through the regular political process. So the legislature will pass a map, and the governor signs it or vetoes it. So if the state government is unified, again, like Mike said, you usually end up with a map that favors the majority party. If there's divided government, oftentimes you end up with a deadlock, or sometimes with a bipartisan incumbent protection plan. And if you ended up with a deadlock within the state government, it ends up in court. And oftentimes courts end up drawing lots and lots of redistricting maps. And this is true not only for those states that are unable to pass a map, but also for lots and lots of states that are able to pass a map, but then are sued. So almost virtually, so just this week, right, the Florida State Supreme Court approved a revised map of the state congressional boundaries. So this, it's an unbelievable amount of litigation. Texas is still not done. We're still not done in Texas. We're still waiting for a federal 3-judge panel to make its decision. They heard the case like 3 years ago. And Florida might not still be done. The decision helps Democrats, but the northernmost, Corinne Brown, is a Democratic African-American representative. She's not happy with her new district, and she says that it violates the Voting Rights Act, and she says that she's going to sue in federal court, so we still might not be done in Florida. So it's really been, we're always litigating, but this has been a really remarkable round, that so many states are still halfway through the cycle, still in litigation. So I want to make the case that gerrymandering affects everybody. I think that most of the public, I don't think I have to make this case very hard, because I think most public feel that partisan gerrymandering is a big problem. And so I don't think this is a difficult case to make. But if you think about the difference between legislative gerrymandering and congressional gerrymandering, right? If Oklahoma or Texas wants, the Republicans want to gerrymander the map, it doesn't affect you if they gerrymander their legislative map, but it does affect you if they gerrymander their congressional map, right? So if enough states, and the numbers are at the moment, there's a pretty good, the Republicans, not surprisingly, since they drew most of the maps, have an aggregate advantage. And so this affects everybody, right? It affects the whole country. So the Republicans have more seats in Congress than they probably should, right, if we had more fair districts across the country. All right, so how can we improve it? Lots of reformers want to work on the process, right? And the maps are drawn by state legislators, right? It's interesting to know that members of Congress have no power, no direct power in redistricting. Lots of members of Congress also hire lobbyists on their own behalf to lobby their own state legislators when redistricting comes around. In fact, one of our state senators says, every 10 years members of Congress come by and the state legislators pretend like we matter, right? They come down to Austin and pretend like we matter because we have their fate in our hands for a brief moment. So state legislators draw their own districts, but not members of Congress are also at the whim of the legislature, assuming there's no commission. So reforming the process, and this appeals. I get why this appeals to lots of people, but it doesn't really appeal to me because if we put the process in the hands of a commission or a court, right, these are all unelected bodies, right? I like having some control over. Right, that's the great thing about legislators, and that's the reason why we have elections, is that we can influence them. And so, if we take it out of their hands and give it to a commission, right, an unelected commission, there's no way for us to punish them if they do a bad job, or credit them if we think that they do a good job. And even if we do reform the process, it certainly doesn't guarantee that we're going to get a good map. Let me just see. For instance, in California, I'm a native Californian, and I don't want to. I'll pick on it a little bit. So their commission, their Citizens Commission, has 14 members. There's 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and then 4 people that are neither Democrats or Republicans. So those are really the only people that matter, right? So if you set up a commission, 5 people over here, 5 people over here, they just cancel each other votes out, and so you give the entire state, right, to the power of these 4 people. And who are they, right? Are they independents? Are they libertarians? Are they Greens? I think they're all of those people. But those people typically make up a very small percentage of the state population, yet we've sort of turned over, right, or California, not we've turned over the process potentially to people that aren't part of the mainstream. So that just doesn't make sense to me politically. And then the Republicans, I know Republicans were dissatisfied in California with the process. And so it's all a conspiracy to them, right? They're like, well, the Democrats did a better job with those 4 nonpartisans, right? Somehow they stacked the deck. And that's really why I don't like the commission process, is that there's going to be winners and there's going to be losers. And then there's probably going to be conspiracy theories about how this happened. And I hate conspiracy theories, right? Because what can you say? There's nothing I could say to disprove it. And so I'd rather have the legislators do it, right? So I'd rather be stabbed in the chest than stabbed in the back, right? So if the Democrats are in control, I know they're going to pass a map that's going to favor the Democrats, and vice versa. But it's like watching National Geographic, right? When the lion kills the gazelle and eats it, that's what we expect to happen, right? And not that it's right, good or bad, but right. So we're not surprised, and we know where to credit or blame what happened. So I think reforming the outcomes is much more direct and much easier, and is far more likely to yield good outcomes. And so then I'll talk about my favorite restriction here in 1 second. And then I think a third way is to kind of use a mix of reforming the process and the outcomes. And this is either crowdsourcing legislative maps or allowing computer algorithms to draw presumably multiple maps that then legislators would pick from. So I'll talk about all of these. All right, so my favorite one for legislative redistricting is to set a partisan benchmark for the state. All right, and this is actually how we as political scientists measure how badly a state is gerrymandered, right? So we say, okay, what's the most, is Pennsylvania the worst one out of whack, Eric? I think it is. Pennsylvania is one of the worst. I think I have that in my example here. Yeah. So how can we tell? Well, because almost all of the congressional seats are Republican, but if you look at like state elections in Pennsylvania, it's a relatively close, maybe even a democratically leaning state. And so there have been several states that have proposed this, including Ohio recently, and also New Jersey. And so the idea is to say, let's figure out a way to measure how Republican and how Democratic we are ahead of redistricting, and then set that as a target. right? So we're 53% Republican in the state, right, whatever, Michigan. So congressional seats should be roughly 53% Republican and 47% Democratic. And the same for the legislature. And then after that, you know, we can comply with the Voting Rights Act and compactness and contiguity and end up with, you know, maps that reasonably reflect the underlying partisanship. And so California, I think it's good if the Democrats did somehow hijack it. I think it's good, not because I'm a Democrat, but because the state is Democratic. And so I think the Democrats should have been in control. I don't think the Independents or the Green Party or the Libertarians should be in control in California, because California's Democratic. All right. So typically the way you do this is you pick a set of elections, statewide elections, the presidential election, gubernatorial election, senatorial election. In Texas, we elect 5,000 other people statewide, the railroad commissioner, right, all these. So you pick a whole bunch of these statewide elective offices and you average them. Now this can be a little bit tricky, right, because we're going to fight about which elections to pick and which elections not to pick. But once we get past that, I think we're in business. So here's the Pennsylvania example. So I looked at, you know, over the last 4 years, the two senatorial elections and the presidential and then the gubernatorial election, and you can see that the average, right, the Democrats won all but one of these, and if you average them, right, the Democrats got 52.5% of the vote, and the Republicans got 47.5% of the vote. So that's a reasonable kind of estimate of the partisanship of the state. So the problem is that they have 18 seats in the House. So the current delegation is 13R and 5D, right? So it's nowhere near what it really should be, which is somewhere along the line of like, so 52.5% of 13 is 9.45 seats. So the obvious number of seats the Democrats should have in Pennsylvania, in my mind, it's either 9 or 10. That's it. There should be no real other outcome on paper. Right now, things can change. Elections can change this. There can be a swing in favor of the Republicans, and that's all well and good. But on paper, right, that it should either be 9 or 10. 5 minutes. All right. So commissions. Oh, I talked about this. So here in Iowa, you have the legislative, and it seems to work in Iowa, right? And I'm not entirely sure how, but you guys seem to be happy with it, and outcomes seem to be all well and good. I'm not quite sure why that's the case, but there's huge lawsuits. There was a huge lawsuit in Arizona. There's been lawsuits in California. And again, the problem with commissions is once you create a commission, how do you populate them? And Eric kind of implied it, talked about it a little bit, but the process to populate the California Commission is this like 8-step Rube Goldberg-like machine process, right? Where they're trying to, right, find the 14 people in the state that aren't political or something. And so, you know, like I said, it's just, I think the process reforms are less likely to work. I think another possible way is to have computer algorithms draw maps. And I wouldn't have a computer draw one map and we're stuck with it. I think that let's have a computer algorithm or multiple algorithms, draw dozens and dozens and dozens of maps, and then maybe set up a process after that for how we're going to pick one of these maps, right? So rather than letting somebody going around drawing their own maps, let's let the computers draw them, give them certain algorithms, and the algorithms are going to matter, right? But give the legislators a bunch of choices, and they could pick from those. There was some contest this last time in Virginia. There was a contest where they tried to get people, usually it was like law school students or undergraduate political science classes, to draw their own maps. And so I think those are other sources of where we could get maps that might produce less biased results. So we could limit the legislators. So partisan gerrymandering mistranslates votes into seats, and that's not a good thing. The Supreme Court is not likely to do anything. They kind of, in the 2000 round, they kind of took away the standards that they had at that particular time. And at the moment, partisan gerrymandering is neither constitutional nor unconstitutional. And I don't think they're ready to take the issue back up again now. Maybe the next round, perhaps, we'll see. Particularly if there's a change in the court. The flavor of the decade was actually racial gerrymandering. Racial gerrymandering is becoming even more of a morass with the litigation and whatnot. And it's still unclear to me where we're going to end up with racial gerrymandering. But that's really becoming, I mean, I study redistricting, but I think we might be at the point where it's like, having single member districts and defining geographies for our legislators seems to be a huge mistake to me. And so maybe if we went to, not that it's going to happen, but if we went to a proportional system, we could sort of forget about all this, right? Instead of trying to draw certain districts in certain states for African Americans or Hispanics, we just have a proportional system, and naturally a Hispanic party would emerge, an African American group would emerge, whatever. We'd have 5 or 6 groups, parties, and that seems to be, it seems much more, the further we go down the road of restricting how people can draw the maps, it kind of gets uglier and uglier in my mind. So I think that's what I wanted to end with. So thank you very much.
That was great. I always make my Congress students draw fake gerrymandered districts with the online games you can play. So if you're interested in this, there's a video game online you can play, and like they've set targets and you have to draw the districts, and so they get really into it. So some of them have a brilliant future in gerrymandering ahead. All right, so our last speaker today is Tim Hagle, who comes right from across the way there. He is an associate professor of political science at the University of Iowa. Many of you have probably heard him on the radio here. He's a political expert on how the caucuses work and how Iowans respond to candidates and their campaign strategies. But he's also written on the Iowan redistricting system and is an expert in constitutional law. So he's going to kind of combine those things together for us today. Tim?
Just in case I have a Marco Rubio moment. Well, like other folks, I'd like to thank you for being here today, especially since a pep rally for the Hawkeyes was scheduled at exactly the same time. I'm not sure who was in charge of that. I suppose also I should, for purposes of full disclosure, I also did my graduate work at Michigan State. So tomorrow is what I call the employer versus alma mater bowl, and we'll see who wins. I have definitely mixed loyalties there. I also, unlike the other folks, I'm going to rely on my written notes a little bit more closely. That way it will make sure that I stay between about 10 and 15 minutes instead of 25 or 30. You're welcome. As Tracy said, my research interests tend to lie more in the legal side of things, and so when Tracy asked me to speak and talk a little bit about particularly one case dealing with redistricting, I kind of took that tack to it, and I think by the time I finish, I want to kind of bring it back to an idea of political discourse as well. So my focus is going to be a little less specific on the redistricting, and hopefully you'll bear with me. In Shelby County versus Holder, Supreme Court's case from 2013, Chief Justice Roberts begins his majority opinion by saying, "The Voting Rights Act of 1965 employed extraordinary measures to address an extraordinary problem." Before getting into the specifics of the problem and the remedy that was used, I need to provide just a little bit more context for folks. As you are likely aware, voting is an area where the state and the federal governments both have responsibilities. Federal law, of course, is superior to state law when the two are in conflict, and the federal government certainly has obligations via the 15th Amendment and various statutes to ensure that voting is accessible to all. Nevertheless, federal law does not dictate all aspects of voting, and states have powers consistent with both the 10th Amendment and, as well, general notions of federalism. One of those notions of federalism that's often lost or forgotten today is that states have, as noted by Chief Justice Roberts in his opinion in Shelby County, broad autonomy in structuring their governments and pursuing legislative objectives. This allows the states to adopt a variety of methods of redistricting concerning state and congressional legislative districts that we've been talking about today. We've already heard about the various methods used by the states. In Iowa, redistricting is done by a nonpartisan entity with approval by the state legislative bodies. Iowa law requires that district plans not consider politics of the people involved, including the effect a plan might have on incumbents. That the districts be as compact as possible, be as even as possible in terms of population, and that at the congressional level not cross county lines. So in Iowa right now, because as was mentioned, it's a pretty square state, we basically just go like this, and there are the 4 counties, or the 4 districts. It might get a little trickier the next time we lose a seat, and by the end of the century, we'll probably be down to 1 at-large, so it won't even matter for us anymore. Other states, of course, use different methods, including, as mentioned, those that serve to protect incumbents or more generally to advantage the party that's in control, and that's their choice, at least as far as we are now. Maybe the Supreme Court will change that a little bit later. Unfortunately, reasons for drawing district lines in some places were for discriminatory purposes, and this is where the Voting Rights Act comes into play. At the time the Act was passed in 1965, there was lingering, officially sanctioned discrimination against blacks, particularly in several southern states. One aspect of this discrimination that affected voting was that there was a great disparity in the percentages of whites and blacks that were registered to vote and that turned out on election day. The 6 states and several additional counties and other states where these disparities were the largest, and the product of intentional discrimination via the use of tests and other mechanisms of restricting voter registration, were called covered states and counties. Because of this past discrimination, the Voting Rights Act required that these covered states and counties had to seek special permission from the federal government before they made any changes to their voting procedures in order to eliminate the discrimination. This permission took the form of either what is known as pre-clearance from the United States Attorney General or through a judicial determination by the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. This requirement was seen as extreme given the sovereign nature of the states. It was also seen as necessary given the evidence of past discrimination in these same areas. In other contexts, the Supreme Court has long authorized much more specific and strict limitations on the activities of governmental entities when the limitation is intended to remedy proven past discrimination. The disparities in voter registration in the covered states and counties were clearly the result of such past discrimination. So the extreme step of requiring some states to be subject to this process was seen as warranted by the Supreme Court when it first considered the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act in 1966. After 40 years, much progress was made, so much in fact that the voter registration percentage of blacks in some of the covered areas was above that of whites in those same areas. In addition, a significant number of minority members were now office holders in these areas. Nevertheless, in 2006, when the U.S. Congress, after holding hearings and doing extensive research, reauthorized the Voting Rights Act for another 25 years, it used the same formulas for determining the areas to be covered as had been the case in 1965. In other words, Congress failed to take into consideration any progress made in the covered areas over the previous 40-plus years. That brings us to the case of Shelby County versus Holder, which was decided again by the Supreme Court in 2013. Without getting too deeply into the specifics, Shelby County, which is in Alabama, which is a covered state, sought a declaratory judgment holding that certain sections of the Voting Rights Act were unconstitutional. In particular, the county essentially argued that certain sections of the Voting Rights Act were unconstitutional based on the fundamental notion of equal sovereignty, both between the states and between states and the federal government. In addition, when the Supreme Court imposes an extreme remedy, it must be narrowly tailored and necessary, to use the language they usually refer to achieve the intended goal, and Shelby County argued that the old formulas contained in the 2006 reauthorization did not meet this standard. The U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia and the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit both held that the act was in fact constitutional, but when it got to the Supreme Court reversed. After reviewing current census data and noting that forcing some states to seek federal permission was an extreme remedy, the court held that to ensure the remedy fit the problem, that more current data had to be used. In other words, being on the covered list should not be considered a permanent limitation on the covered area's sovereign rights, and the coverage formula had to take into consideration current data, the current situation. As the court phrased it, the act imposes current burdens and must be justified by current needs. The court also noted that the specific mechanisms used to discriminate against minorities had been outlawed and not used in years, if not decades. Basically, the justifications for placing areas into the covered status had to be changed. Here again, the court's willingness and desire to update a situation based on changed circumstances is not new. In fact, the notion of changed circumstances is a key consideration when the court is revisiting either one of its own decisions or some legislative act. A somewhat related example comes from the school desegregation cases, where once a school district is put under a desegregation order by a court, the matter is revisited after a plan is put in place to see if progress is being made. And if it is, then the order can be lifted. Although the Supreme Court indicated that it was reluctant to overturn part of an act of Congress, and the dissenters in Shelby County certainly objected to doing so, the decision was actually fairly narrow. A recent article examining the first 10 years of Chief Justice Roberts' tenure by a university alumnus and former student of mine, as a matter of fact, noted that the court only struck down the preclearance provision because it was based on 40-year-old factual record rather than on current data. In other words, all the court really said was that the formula had to be updated. That might mean that some previously covered areas would no longer be required to submit voting changes to the federal government, but that would depend on the updated formulas, and of course whether the Supreme Court would find such updated formulas to be narrowly tailored to the current situation. So what do redistricting and Shelby County versus Holder have to do with political discourse? This is where I take that left turn I told you about. At one level, redistricting is a method voters and their representatives use to engage in the political process, directly or through those chosen representatives. At another level, if we think of discourse in terms of political conversations on the topics of the day, we know that we live in a time of often hyper-partisanship. Nearly every recent event that occurs is viewed through a political lens and is often immediately used for political purposes, even when the narrative, as we call it today, doesn't really fit. An unfortunate example of this occurred on Wednesday with the attack in San Bernardino, California. Before hardly any details of the incident were known, and there was still an active shooter alert at the time, some very prominent office holders and candidates rushed to make political statements about the shooting. As more details emerged, it appeared that their initial narrative regarding the nature of the incident proved to be false. My point is that there's often too much of a tendency to jump to conclusions and not wait to learn about or understand the details of a situation before using it for political gain. To a certain extent, this was true for the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County versus Holder as well. When the decision was announced, there was all manner of doom and gloom and the sky is falling rhetoric from some folks who wanted those formulas to remain in place. The concern that updating the coverage formula, and possibly removing some states from the covered requirements was no doubt genuine, and that was expressed most strongly by the dissenters in the case. Unfortunately, some of the rhetoric others were expressing those concerns made having a constructive conversation more generally very difficult, if not in some cases impossible. We've seen other events where some have called for stopping incendiary language on some topic. Despite such calls, some of those same people often engage in similarly incendiary language on some other issue of their choosing. Just yesterday, I was interviewed by a student journalist who asked me why young people tend to be less politically engaged. Among other reasons, I suggested that many young people are simply turned off by the excessively argumentative nature of a good deal of political discourse. Of course, that reason for turning away from the political process is not exclusive to young people. The First Amendment's free speech clause protects our ability to speak out even if that speech is offensive. So it's not, or shouldn't be, a matter of trying to ban offensive speech. Sometimes offensive speech, or at least speech that some might find offensive, is necessary. As the Supreme Court noted in reviewing the Voting Rights Act, extraordinary measures might be needed to address extraordinary problems. Such extraordinary measures may sometimes include offensive speech just to cut through the regular chatter. Nevertheless, such extraordinary measures should not be an everywhere all the time approach, or it loses much of its value. Rather, it may be that in the course of exercising their free speech rights, people also remember that those rights carry responsibilities. Perhaps, as a way to increase the productivity of political discourse, not to mention increasing the participation of the public in the political process, there should be an increase in civility and a willingness to listen. And I yield back the balance of my time. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, panelists. Just a reminder, if you guys have questions as we're doing the Q&A, there's these little blue cards, so I see one already. Go right there. Hold on, I'll kind of hold them up so Leslie can see them and she'll bring them up to me. All right, so many thanks to our speakers, and Tim's last comments remind us of kind of where we started this morning, which is the idea here is not simply to educate, which our panelists have done a lovely job of doing in a really complicated topic that involves all of the institutions, right? As we heard, it's a back and forth between voters who put people in, and then the legislators themselves, and perhaps some commissions, and then some courts, and it's a very complicated process. But that part of that process is actually discussing what the options might be, and asking questions and kind of learning about what those options might be. And so, with that, we'll open it up to questions. All right, so I've already received a couple, so I'm going to start with those. All right, so the first question is long. Kelly's giggling because she wrote it. But I'm going to translate for her as I do get where she's going with this. So she said, we've talked a lot today about fair representation in terms of partisanship, but to what extent do you think redistricting can be used to promote fairer, more representative legislatures in other terms? So, for instance, in terms of race or in terms of gender. How could the redistricting process make legislatures fairer in other ways as well?
The one thing that I would say, I think, race is uniquely protected by the Voting Rights Act, and so it becomes a part. It's a very integral part of the redistricting conversation every 10 years, and party is as well because people tend to live, in partisan communities. Some places are more partisan than others, and so it's easier to draw lines to reflect that. I think gender is harder because every place has lots of both men and women. The one way I would think that you could actually promote more women in office through redistricting is, not necessarily through a commission, but whatever your mechanism is, to just radically redraw the lines, because it really shakes up incumbency and forces incumbents to run against a lot of newcomers, and that certainly happened in California. We had a lot of turnover after the new lines went in place. And a lot of people who were running in very unfamiliar territory, and it hurt them, quite honestly. And I think that encourages new people to get involved. But that's the way that I would think that not just gender, but some other things that don't have a sort of geographic element to them, you might promote more representation from those sorts of communities.
Single-member districts are really bad for trying to equally represent gender. I agree with Eric that we do a reasonably good job with race, although the court has also been specific that, by requiring the drawing of majority-minority districts, we're not requiring proportionality, which I thought was kind of weird. So what are you requiring? So it's something less than proportional amount of seats for minorities. And other countries, so the Western countries, America, Canada, Great Britain, and Australia, that use single-member district systems, although the other three countries use parliamentary systems. Women's representation is really bad, whereas in proportional systems, you could have quotas, you could have reserved seats. There's lots of direct, straightforward mechanisms. And so since the parties matter so little here, it's not like the Republican Party can say, well, we're going to have 50% of our candidates be women. That's just kind of impossible to do it in the single-member district system. So I think we'd need a completely different system.
Anyone else like to weigh in? Okay. All right, so this is a two-parter. But the parts aren't particularly related. But there are things that many of you brought up today. One question is something that Mike raised, which is there a reason that the Constitution calls for actual enumeration rather than having some kind of survey mechanism for counting population? And then sort of a question joke, but it's actually quite relevant to something that Tom said, which is maybe Pennsylvania should forcibly relocate their Democrats to make sure that could actually work to sort of balance the idea of the state's partisanship with the drawing of districts. So either of those questions could be open to anyone.
Maybe I'll try to address the first question. Why do we have to actually count? And I think when they were writing this part of the Constitution, they didn't think about doing a survey, right? So this was at the Constitutional Convention. There's actually a lot of debate over the size of the districts. And it was George Washington's basically only contribution to the Constitution was the size of the districts to be, I think, about 33,000 inhabitants. But I think it was really, no one envisioned at the convention doing a survey and, the mathematics around that, how it would be more accurate. I think the Democrats, trying to remember which time they did this, they actually proposed to do it via an estimation, but the court said it was not allowed. So, I don't think there was specific, we need to go down this path and not the other, just it was the times.
And the census originally was used for taxing purposes too. We didn't have a federal income tax until the 20th century, so it had this dual purpose of apportioning the House of Representatives, but also for apportioning how much tax each state was going to owe the federal government. And so that was nice because they kind of balance each other, right? I mean, paying taxes is a negative, but getting more seats in the House is a positive. So it kind of had this nice balance. But once we started the federal income tax, that was no longer part of the purpose of the census. And then of course, back then they didn't have survey techniques, at all. So they couldn't imagine actual enumeration. I think made perfect sense at the time. But the problem with this actually in the 1990s, the Democrats and the Clinton administration wanted to adjust the census using statistical methods. But what we would have ended up with is actually no better than the census itself, and it could have been worse depending on how badly the survey was done. So what they were going to do was they were still going to try to count everybody, and then they were going to do a secondary, smaller census that was going to be really accurate, right? And then they were going to compare the really accurate small census to the larger, clunkier, not so accurate census, and then make adjustments based on this. And so, and this is a reasonably valid technique. It's called capture recapture. It's how you estimate the number of fish in a pond, the number of bats in the cave, stuff like this. But it's not perfect. And I think there would have been a lot of political problems from it as well. So I don't know if the survey is the best answer either.
Just a couple thoughts. One is that the census actually does use surveys for a lot of the questions, right? Not most people don't get the full length, the long form census survey. They get the shorter one that just says, "Are you here?" basically. And so there is some survey methodology has crept into the census, but I agree it's not something that's a part of the central count that we use for the districts. And then as for Pennsylvania, Trail of Tears suggestion, I think short of moving people forcibly, one possibility is to draw the districts very aggressively to split up those Democratic strongholds. So part of what makes things hard for Democrats, not just the partisan gerrymandering, it's also that Democrats tend to be concentrated in these central cities. That means they run up the numbers in a handful of districts, win those districts by very large margins, when all they needed was to win a seat by 50% plus one. And so you could take all of those extra supporters, theoretically, and move them to other districts, and they could become supporters in those districts and help Democrats win those as well. That doesn't happen as much with Republicans because Republicans tend to live in rural areas and are more spread out. So what they did in Illinois, I think everybody agrees in the last cycle, was a partisan gerrymander. However, in terms of the partisan, this question of sort of partisan distribution and sizes of majorities in districts, it's actually a pretty fair plan. And it's because the Democrats sent these sort of spears into Chicago, and just picked out some little chunks of Democratic supporters from the heavily Democratic areas and connected them to supporters out further in rural areas, and thereby mollified this distortion that happens just because of the nature of political geography.
I should add on this point about sort of having these very heavily Democratic districts. It's not necessarily the Republicans saying, we're going to put all these Democrats in here and we're going to take advantage. A lot of the Democrats who represent those districts are very happy, right? If you're a member of Congress and look, you're going to get 75% of the vote every time, you're going to fight for that plan, right? It's harder to find the member who says, you know what, put me at 55%, it's fine. And so, you mentioned the Florida case where the district that, might be changed, the representative suing, saying, it's not fair to me. There's a case in, I think I have this right, in Virginia, where there's a lawsuit against it. And one of the questions is standing because no one from the district is part of the lawsuit. It's people who are outside of the district. Now, it gets a little complicated because if you change the lines, they may then be in the district, because anytime you change one district, you by definition have to change at least one other, if not a number of other districts. So that's one reason why it's so complicated is you can't just change one thing and everything's, the solution presents itself.
So I'm going to follow up on something that comes out in some of these questions as well that you guys have alluded to, which is the ideal size of a congressional district particularly. Of course, it'll vary for state legislatures depending on the state population. But for Congress, as Mike mentioned, the George Washington numbers are largely what they started with, I think 30 or 40,000 in the Constitution originally, and now they are well over 700,000, I believe. Is that right? Yeah, so given that, what is your ideal size of district, and what would that involve in changing the U.S.?
So my ideal size of district probably is inversely related to how big I think the legislature should be. So this is difficult, right? Probably a smaller district, you probably get better representation, maybe more access to your member. So New Hampshire in the legislature, I don't know the exact number, but it's well over 400 representatives in the legislature in New Hampshire with only 2 members of Congress, right? So it's a pretty small state, very small House districts. But as you decrease the size of the district, you increase the size of the legislature. So, right, the current House now, 435 voting members. I think one of the ways we could have some reform in the Congress is to make it easier to get a piece of legislation to the floor and get voted on. One reason why we have more restrictions on sort of getting legislation to the floor in the House is there's so many people, right? And so if every member of the House had floor access, you'd have so many bills you try to pass, and there's ways you sort of trick that down a little bit. But we're worried about the Hastert rule, right? And that's partly a function of we need to control floor access so we can actually pass some legislation. Now I think that's been tightened down so much that we can't pass any legislation. But to pick a number, I would say, look, you're going to have to worry about, you're going to double, you're going to have 700 or 800-900 people in the House of Representatives. That's unworkable. So I don't know. It's a hard question.
Yeah, I mean, on the flip side of New Hampshire, California has 120 people total in the legislature, and the Senate is 40 members. There's 53 congressional districts in California. So the state senators actually represent more people than the members of Congress. And, is that good? I get asked this question every once in a while, and I've never, it's to my shame that I've never looked at the evidence one way or the other, because I think you can make arguments for bigger districts, you can make arguments for smaller districts, and so I'd love to see the evidence of what kind of benefit it actually makes on a variety of dimensions. I think it's basically an empirical question. You should look and see what the impact is. So.
Okay. So I think we did get Tom's answer to this question, I think, but we want everyone to weigh in, and certainly Tom to weigh in again. We have 2 questions about partisanship versus nonpartisanship. One asks, what could encourage other states to move to a nonpartisan system? And the other says, Iowa is 40% nonpartisan, 30% Democrat, 30% Republican. So why should Democrats and Republicans get 100% of the seats? So are there ways to encourage either nonpartisan seats or nonpartisan redistricting in the states that might work?
Iowa's not really 40% nonpartisan. Right? That's the short answer. Lots of people that say they're neither a Democrat or Republican really are Democrats or Republicans. They just don't want to admit it. And if not, well, then start a party, for heaven's sake, and quit messing around, because right? I mean, that's the answer, right? You can't, because you still vote for Democrats or Republicans, and you look and act a lot like Democrat and Republican voters. And so, and that's true not just of Iowa. This is true of almost every state in America. But the fact of the matter is that most of them are Democrats and Republicans. So, yeah, the problem is that none of those people actually agree with each other on anything, right? And so that's separate from the question of independent redistricting and what could you do to encourage more of it. That was the question, right?
Yes.
So I think commissions are tough because you need to do them basically in states. Either it has to be something that is a creature of the legislature. So that happened just recently in Ohio. They created a new redistricting commission that effectively is like a special committee of the legislature in a way. I mean, and plus the governor's on it and stuff like that. But it's not like it's supposed to be separate from politics. It's just a way for them to resolve their differences, and it has some of the kinds of rules about how the districts ought to be drawn that that Tom has been talking about. And so, in that sense, it's not that different than what Tom would be advocating, I think.
No, that's
but then you also have the independent commissions. I think to get those, you really need some kind of either you have to have it imposed from above by Congress. That's not hugely likely, although there are bills floating around Congress. Or you have to have it come up through a citizen initiative process, and not every state has those. So I think or you could have the courts impose it as a solution, a permanent solution, but they have never shown any willingness to do something like that. So it's a solution. Commissions, I think, could be we could see change in that direction, but it's not going to probably be anything that every state adopts, an independent commission, like in California for sure.
All right, so our next question is something that Tim introduced in his discussion of the Shelby County case, which is the idea that what the court really said was, okay, now you have to reconsider how race might count under the Voting Rights Act and what you might ask states to do to ensure fair racial representation in redistricting. So wondering if the panelists could comment on what they think that might look like relative to the Shelby County case.
Actually, as I was reading through the case before today's presentation, I was wondering that very thing, that I wasn't aware of particular proposals that have been floating around. I'm thinking, well, if the Supreme Court wants the folks that are going to be drafting the new version of the Voting Rights Act or a new section that was declared unconstitutional, what formulas exactly would they use? What problem do they see that's still in existence? And so I think that's where you, in some sense, have to start, is saying, well, what do we see is still the problem here? How do we craft a solution to address that problem? Because that's what they basically did originally in the Voting Rights Act. And again, extraordinary problem, extraordinary solution. Do we still have that problem? Some would argue yes, some would argue no. And so that's the first, I suppose, a problem to overcome, is to identify what the current situation is, and then, as I say, craft a solution to meet it.
I'm going to answer the question by not answering the question, which is what I think the court did. So, you know, the court basically said, okay, this old coverage formula is bad. Congress, you guys just figure out a new one, you know, and pass a law, right? With the clear expectations that there's no way Congress, at least the current Congress, was going to get its act together and pass a law with an updated coverage formula. So coming up with one, we could write one down right now, probably about 10 minutes to come up with something, right? To get Congress to actually pass this piece of legislation, it's not going to happen. At least I think under the current Congress it won't.
And it's important to remember that this is only for Section 5. So the two important sections in the Voting Rights Act are Section 2, which covers the entire country and is still in place and will stay in place until somebody overturns the law. And then Section 5 was this pre-clearance, and this was critically important in the 1960s when the South continued to update its methods of discriminating against black people. So if the Supreme Court struck down the poll tax, Alabama would come up with a new way, right, the next day, right? Okay, we can't have a poll tax, so we'll have a literacy test. And so that's what this was, the logic behind Section 5, was we need to get ahead of this, right? So they can't, because it would take 2 years to litigate it and strike down a literacy test. So it worked incredibly well, and it was very effective, and it was highly needed. I don't know if it's still needed today, but I'm sure I'd pass some new standards and have it, because it would cover different states as well, right? If we came up with a new method. But the Voting Rights Act is still in place, right? I mean, you can't discriminate on the basis of race in politics because Section 2 is still there. So states, basically the southern states just don't have to pre-clear laws when they pass them with the federal government.
I'm being tacky and saying what time it is because I forgot my phone.
4:25.
Oh, sweet. We're doing great. All right. So we're going to make it through all of our questions. And apparently Mike came up with our new next Discourse symposium, which is what is wrong with Congress. So we already have lots of questions for that one. So we also blame Mike for this. Do you have a favorite district? If so, where and what kind of community does it favor?
So I said I like that one in California. That was an older district. I don't think it exists anymore. It's only connected at high tide or low tide.
It was called the Ribbon of Shame, and it ran along the coast. Yeah. Anyway,
What's your favorite, Eric?
my favorite district, the one that I like to cuddle up with at night. I don't know. I really liked. I mean, I assume when you ask favorite district, the one that looks the weirdest when you look at it. That's how I interpret that question. And by that, there was a district in North Carolina that was actually prompted a key Supreme Court decision in the 1990s about the Voting Rights Act, and it was it was trying to create a second majority-minority district in North Carolina, and it ran right along the highway. It's because there's the eastern part of the state is heavily African American, and then the rest of the African American population is pretty geographically dispersed. They're in little pockets in different places in the state. And so in order to create that second district, they had to draw sort of all along the interstate to try and connect all these little pockets that ran up the interstate. And it produced a very, very strange looking district. But again, this is where the tension between a geographic-based representation system and a representation system where we think other things are as important or maybe more important than geography starts to come into tension. So
there's another good one, which is I had to look it up. It's Goofy Kicking Donald Duck. And it's in Pennsylvania, and if we could put it up here, it really does look like that.
There was another one in Pennsylvania. I was involved in the 2000 redistricting there, and the Democratic head of the state house really had a way with words. He's a really interesting guy. Now he's in prison. He's in prison, of course, because he's so interesting. But he named all of these things, and maybe even named this one. I don't know. But the favorite one that he had for me was the sexually aroused supine seahorse. That's what he called one of them. So I thought that was kind of nice.
All right, can you top that, Tim?
Nope, not even gonna try.
Nobody asked me, but my favorite was always the Illinois. I think it's the 4th Gutierrez district that goes around Chicago like this, and it doesn't look contiguous on the map. It looks like chunks, but it must be some road connecting it all. It's not the tide. All right, so our next question is, how would a multi-party electorate influence redistricting?
this is assuming we have one. How would they influence redistricting? Well, I think it's probably more the other way around, that if you went to a different system of electing people, as Tom was saying, you would end up with more parties. I think the current system we have encourages two parties. It sort of steers things in that direction. It's not the only reason why we have two such dominant parties, but I think it's an important part of it. And so it probably, and the people who call themselves independent, at least, you know, in all the evidence that political science has, suggests these people are very divergent in their opinions. They can be just as divergent as the partisans themselves in some cases. So it's not like that's a cohesive block of people, and that's why these efforts to create some kind of third-party movement that percolate up every so often don't generally go anywhere, because there isn't a movement there, right? There's no kind of coherence. And so you need that you need to see more evidence of that coherence in an independent movement or a third-party movement before they would then be influencing the way that redistricting is done.
I would say we have experimented with not necessarily always having single-member districts. So over the time, they've had at-large districts within the state. Alabama used that, actually, to make sure they elected white people. It sort of was a reaction to something else. There's been, over the years, a few number of multi-member districts. Actually, if you look back into the early 1800s, Philadelphia was a multi-member district. And then over the years, a lot of states, you know, maybe they would gain a new seat through redistricting, and rather than go through the process of redistricting, so let's just throw another at-large person up there, and everyone can agree with that. So we haven't always had the same single-member district process, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's just by statute.
It is.
Yeah. So they could, you could do little tweaks, going to sort of a proportional system would be a massive change. But there are sort of smaller things that we could do just by statute change.
Although I suppose at this point you couldn't have, they would often overlay one at-large district over the top of all the other districts in a state when they just couldn't figure out how to. This is the kind of thing that used to happen before a series of important Supreme Court decisions in the 60s that said that all districts had to be, Mike talked about this in his presentation, that all districts had to be equal in population. It used to be sometimes the legislatures just couldn't agree on how to, they'd get a new district and they, in reapportionment, and they'd be like, I don't know what to do with this. So they just slap it on top of the whole state. And that you can't do that anymore because the population would be different in the at-large district versus the others.
All right, so our last question goes back to the Voting Rights Act, but takes a little different turn. But we were wondering, can you comment on the, I believe, Alabama's closing of voter registration offices that has happened recently? Or have we stumped you?
Well, Section 5 doesn't exist anymore. It's I think it's a sign that it probably would be a good thing if Congress had that conversation about revising the Voting Rights Act. There is actually a provision in the Act where you can opt in a jurisdiction if you have enough evidence of racial discrimination, and there's some activists who've been talking about trying to pursue that approach aggressively. There are actually two, like California has, LA County and Alameda County are still covered under the voting. They have to pre-clear under the Voting Rights Act, but they opted themselves in. So they said, we want to be part of the Voting Rights Act, so please make us part of the Voting Rights Act.
I think it was, no, go ahead, Tim.
I was just going to say, one of the things that the dissenters in Shelby County versus Holder talked about was they said that, look, the formulas that we have in place, the Voting Rights Act itself, that they allowed this progress to occur. And their concern was that if you remove the pre-clearance requirement, that perhaps the states would begin to discriminate again. And so maybe that's what's behind the closing of voter registration stations, especially if they're taking place in certain areas more heavily populated by minorities, something of that nature. The fact that the state didn't have to pre-clear that kind of thing simply means that if they do and somebody wants to bring suit, they still can. Of course, that puts the burden then on somebody else to prove that the state is doing what it did to have either discriminatory purpose or discriminatory effect, which can take time and a lot of money. But these days, probably you have a greater chance for somebody to be able to fund that type of litigation. But again, that still could take several years before it would work its way up to potentially the Supreme Court. But if it does happen, if that type of thing does happen, then it would provide additional justification if somebody wanted to reintroduce the pre-clearance requirements if they see that type of regression occurring.
And I think it was Alabama or what a neighboring state admitted that they hadn't been complying with the motor voter law that was passed in 1993, which required them to put registration materials in the DMV. Do states ignore laws? Everybody ignores laws here and there. But this isn't good. I think that it's terrible to do. And even worse, it's not going to have an impact. Legislators are risk averse, and they're always worried. Republicans don't want to increase turnout because they think it's going to hurt them. Democrats want to increase turnout because they think it's going to help them. But even a 10% increase in turnout would have almost no effect. And motor voter increased registration by 10% and an increased turnout by 0%. So anytime we have things like this, right, they are worried because they want to keep their jobs, which is good. But all the voter ID, it doesn't matter either way. It's not going to impact the election outcomes. And so sometimes they get a little too excited about some of this stuff, I think.
I also think it may be a little harder, paradoxically, in modern politics to prove a racial motivation for any change that you might make, because back when when the Voting Rights Act was first passed, race and party were pretty orthogonal to each other. They were not really. There were a lot of people in both parties, a lot of especially in the South, there were a lot of Democrats in the South. That's not really true anymore, and a lot of white Democrats in the South. And now there's a real racial dimension to partisanship in the South, and that makes it easy to sort of say, well, the change I'm making is really about partisanship and not about race, and it's hard to prove that counterfactual.
Let's thank our final panel here because they did a nice job.